Folks, and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology on Demand. And today we are going to explore the structures in the central nervous system. So this first topic is all going to be about the brain. And when we're talking about the brain, what we really mean is the majority of the brain which falls into this structure known as the cerebrum, which is what you see on the picture here. This is our conscious kind of brain, but it does a whole lot of other stuff you learn about in lecture as well. So when we look at the cerebrum, it is divided into various sections known as lobes. Okay? But first, to do the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere, because we have this huge valley that separates them, not completely, but it goes quite deep. And this is in the mid-sagittal line, and it's called the longitudinal fissure. It's outlined in orange in your picture. If we look at the side of the brain, what you will notice is that the brain kind of looks like a mitten like this, with the fingertips of the mitten being the anterior portion. And there is a groove right here between the fingers and the thumb. And that groove is called the lateral fissure. If I go back to that first picture of the brain, the lateral fissure would be coming in right here. I think we have some other pictures later on that demonstrate it better, but that's where it would be on that one. So on the left lobe, lateral fissure is here. On the right cerebral hemisphere, lateral fissure would be in this direction. Okay. The next thing is to look at the brain from above. So this view, in case you haven't figured it out, is the skull is cut in a horizontal plane and the skull cap is taken off. You can tell which part is anterior. It's this area up here because these are the very large frontal sinuses that we learned about. If you go about between halfway and 2/3 of the way posteriorly, there is a sulcus. Remember, the sulcus is the valley. There is a sulcus that starts and travels almost all the way down to that lateral fissure, and it starts more posteriorly and then kind of works in an anterior direction. So on a lateral view of the brain, here it is starting, and then it kind of meanders and makes its way down to where that lateral fissure is. So this is an important dividing line between the first two lobes of the brain we're going to talk about. If we are anterior to that central sulcus, so let's stop and look at this picture for a second. Right here is where the lateral fissure would be. Can everybody clearly see that? So in this case, your mitten is going in this direction. So anterior is over to the right side of the screen. And then if you can see, this fissure goes almost all the way down to the lateral fissure. It'll never go all the way there, but it goes almost all the way down. So that is that central sulcus there. If we are anterior to the central sulcus, all the cerebral tissue anteriorly is called the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe has a lot of different actions it's responsible for, but one of the main things it does is this is where we have the part of the brain that has to do with movement. And the part of the brain that is super concerned with movement, what we call the primary motor cortex of the brain, is if you go back on this picture, find that central sulcus, and then find the gyrus, the hill that is just anterior to it, okay? So this one right here that I am doing with the pointer, that is the sulcus that is just anterior, that is the gyrus that is just anterior to the central sulcus. And that gyrus is called the precentral gyrus. In other words, before the central sulcus. It's part of the frontal lobe. Okay. Continuing on, going back to the central sulcus, if we are posterior to it, the next part of the brain is called the parietal lobe. So have you figured out by now that the major lobes of the brain are named for the bones of the skull that they're deep to? Okay. So here is the parietal lobe. There is no external surface line that delimitates exactly where the parietal lobe ends and the more posterior occipital lobe is going to begin. So if there's an arrow, it's either going to point to something that's obviously occipital or something that's parietal. Okay. But just like the frontal lobe where we had to learn one gyrus, we have to learn a gyrus in the parietal lobe. But for that, we're going to go back to the central sulcus. And now we're going to look what is the very first gyrus, the most anterior gyrus. And that is called the postcentral gyrus because it's posterior to the central sulcus. So that's it for the temporal lobe, for the parietal lobe. Going inferior to the parietal lobe and represented by the thumb would be the temporal lobe. If we were to dive in deep right here where we have that lateral fissure, what we would see is there actually are hills and valleys. So here's the lateral fissure, and if you go in deep, there's actually gyri and sulci on the surface of the brain deep to that. And this area of the brain is known as the insula. It's not a separate lobe all on its own. It's just a special area of the temporal lobe, a very specific area for when it comes to our special senses. All right. Now that we're done with the temporal lobe, the final lobe of the brain is the most posterior one, and that is known as the occipital lobe. Okay. So with that, we are done with the cerebral structures, and I will see you on the next video as we dive into deeper structures. Thank you, and keep up all the good work.